Hello, students. This is Alan Gilmore, and today we are starting Modular 9, Chapter 9, Mental Health, Substance Abuse, and Developmental Disabilities. This chapter in this modular is going to be a series of 4 videos. I'm going to try to keep them somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes each, but it is taking you through all of the content for Modular 9, and there's a little more of a PowerPoint. The length of the PowerPoint, the size of the PowerPoint is a bit larger than some of our others, and so that results in a longer set of videos. So lots of information to cover here. So let's move forward. So as an introduction, so we're going to be starting off with really talking about mental health issues. Mental health disorders account for 4 of the 10 leading causes of disability worldwide. 25% of the US population is affected by mental disorders in any given year. One of the most predominant mental health disorder is depression, or what's identified as major depression. It is the leading cause of mental disability in the United States for persons 18 years and older, affecting about 15 million people in any given year. 75% of people who experience a mental health issue do not seek treatment. And 50% of people with some type of mental illness say it impairs their ability to function. So let's go back and take a look at this quickly. 25% of the US population is affected by mental disorders in any given year. I don't know if that's surprising to you, but the thing that's always so interesting is that so often a mental health issue is something that is masked or is not readily available. It's not as though seeing someone who has a disability and is in a wheelchair or is blind or is deaf, which are all disabilities, but certainly being a person who's experiencing mental health issues can be a disability. But obviously what we recognize is it's not always as visible or as apparent as other kinds of disabilities that we've seen or that we typically see. Interesting to take a look that 50% of the people who report having experienced a mental illness say that it impaired their ability to function. So in these situations, the mental health disability was so severe that they may not have been able to go to work, go to school, care for their family. It was that severe an experience for them that it prevented them from being able to function. And then finally, 75% of all people with mental illness do not seek treatment. We're going to get a little bit more into that, but it's interesting to think about why would someone choose not to seek treatment? And so something that we're going to spend a little bit more time on. So these are just some statistics around the estimated number of persons with a mental health disorder annually. This information is also found in your book, but I wanted to just quickly kind of give you a snapshot here of the breadth and depth of the number of people who are experiencing mental health disorders. So starting with mood disorders, major depressive disorders, dystemic disorders. This is chronic mild depression. So dystemic disorder, again, chronic mild depression, 3.3 million. Bipolar disorder, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get further into the chapter. 5.7 million, 2.6% of the adult population. Schizophrenia, anxiety disorder, 40 million, 18.1% of the adult population has reported experiencing anxiety disorders. Panic disorders, 6 million. Obsessive compulsive disorders, 2.2 million. Post-traumatic stress disorder, 7.7 million, or 3.5% of the adult population. Generalized anxiety disorders, 6.8 million. Social phobias, 15 million. Agoraphobia, 1.8 million. Specific phobias, 19.2 million. Suicide, 44,173 annually. More than 90% of those who've had a diagnosable mental disorder. So of those who've successfully committed suicide, 90% of them had what would have been a diagnosable mental health disorder. Eating disorders, attention deficit disorders, autism, which we're hearing more and more about these days, and then finally Alzheimer's disease. So talking about the costs that are associated with mental health, the impact that it has financially on us as a society and in terms of individuals, the financial costs come from things like medication, clinic visits, hospitalization. There, of course, are other costs such as loss of productivity at work, the strain that being a person who has a mental health disorder may have on you or your family, issues around crime, and the emotional burden of mental health disorders. Mental health services are available to only 1 out of 8 individuals who need them in the United States. So as a country, we've not been very effective at being able to deliver mental health services where and when they are needed. Studies show that the cost of healthcare could be reduced if more attention were directed to the mental health of individuals. What this is saying is that often what you can find is for those that are experiencing mental health disorders, there can be compounding physical disorders that the person may be having as well. So in other words, due to the fact that they're experiencing a mental health disorder, they may not be taking their blood pressure medication. They may not be managing their diabetes very well. And so because of those particular issues, which is really attributed to their mental health, now their physical health is being impacted as well. So that's what we're saying there. So, and then finally, mental health funds have often experienced funding cuts because of federal or state budget constraints. So often, mental health funds are sometimes the first things to be cut in a budget. Barriers to treatment of mental illness. Services for the mentally ill changed significantly when there was a move in the 60s and 70s from institutional care to community-based care that became known as deinstitutionalization. So deinstitutionalization operated from a philosophy that advocated that the care for individuals with mental health problems might be more effectively delivered if they were able to be in their own communities where their families were at, environments they were familiar with, using outpatient programs whenever appropriate to the client's needs, as opposed to institutionalization. So prior to deinstitutionalization, often people who were experiencing very severe mental health disorders to the point that they were possibly a danger to themselves or to others, they weren't able to live with their families because of the behavioral issues around their mental health issue, would often join or be committed, I'm sorry, that's the word I was looking for, would be committed to an institution that may be located in another part of the state. So up and down the state of California during this time, there would be, all these different mental health treatment facilities. To a certain extent, they certainly look like a jail, but it was a place where people could be centralized in terms of their treatment and in terms of their care and the fact that they were no longer a danger to themselves or to others. So then in the 60s and 70s, there became sort of a push to change the way that we were caring for the people who were experiencing mental health issues. And that became deinstitutionalization, where they were released from those mental health facilities and returned back to the community with the idea that they would be able to then access support services in their own communities and be able to successfully be integrated back into their communities. Barriers to the effective treatment of mental illness includes a lack of available and affordable treatment resources. Kind of gives you an indication about often these communities that people were returning back to were not prepared to care for them or provide them with the level of care that they needed. The stigma associated with mental illness during colonial times. It's interesting to think that there's a lot of research that seems to indicate that when we hear about stories from early in our country where people were being identified as witches, like in the Salem, Massachusetts area, and burned at the stake and all of these different kinds of things, we actually probably were looking at people that were experiencing mental health issues, hallucination, hearing voices and those kinds of things may have been deemed as evil or, like I said, witches, and often were persecuted. Social isolation of those with mental health problems, again, going back to that institutionalization idea, non-compliance with prescribed medications. People who are experiencing mental health issues and are on any kind of mental health med or medication will often share with you that the side effects to the medication are worse than the experiencing of the mental health issue. And so there's often a lot of challenges in terms of finding the right balance of medications, and that often then results in non-compliance, meaning people are just not taking their meds. There's a lack of political will and a lack of community support for mental health services. The issue of mental health and substance abuse as comortalities, half of individuals with severe mental disorders are also affected by substance abuse. 37% of people who abuse alcohol and 53% of individuals who abuse other drugs have at least one serious mental illness. We refer to this as dual diagnosis. This is a co-occurring disorder. It's a condition of suffering from both a mental illness as well as substance abuse problem. But it is important to recognize that having problems in one area does not necessarily mean that you're always going to have problems in the other area. So it's always important to be able to distinguish someone who is exclusively having problems around substance abuse, exclusively having problems around mental health issues, but also recognizing that it's not uncommon for someone who's experiencing one or the other to be experiencing both. So there's a couple of different ways that we take a look at categorizing mental illness, and both of them kind of come from a perspective of how are you treating it or viewing it. One of the ways that you can take a look at mental illness is by using what would be called a medical model. So the easiest way I think to think about this is to think about how would you be treated if you had a physical ailment. There's some part of your body that isn't working the way it's supposed to be working. So if you have diabetes, then you're having problems with your blood sugar. Why can't we be thinking about mental illness in that same way? Because we know quite often what we're seeing is that people are having challenges in terms of the way that their brain is functioning, and that there are certain things that are happening within their brain that may result in them experiencing a mental health issue. So that medical model is really about saying, why can't we look at mental health and mental illness the same way that we take a look at diabetes or heart disease or any other kind of physical ailment, focusing on the physical elements of mental illness. So severe emotional problems caused by brain dysfunction or interpsychic causes. This approach for treatment of mental illness is for treatment to occur in a medical setting. And what you're doing is you're striving for a cure, just like you would be doing if you were experiencing a medical condition. The other way to categorize mental illness is using the PI system. And I hope you might remember from the past modulars that PI is person and environment. It was an approach that was developed by the National Association of Social Workers, and it focuses on a client's ability to cope with the presenting problem and the duration of the problem based on the ecological or systems theory, focuses on social functioning and environmental, mental health, and physical health problems. So again, this goes back to the idea of how people operate within the environments that they're a part of. And if they're experiencing mental illness, are there ways that we can make modifications or changes to their environment in order to help them be more successful as they live with their mental illness? So are there accommodations that could be made in a workplace? Are there accommodations that could be made in a school setting for a student or for an employee who is experiencing mental illness so that they may be more successful in those environments because of the adaptations or changes that get made? So that's the idea behind the PI system. The authors of the textbook talk about Thomas Shaw's. I'm never quite sure whether I'm saying his last name correctly. And he's quoted as saying that mental health is promoted by our competence in dealing with our environment and our confidence in being able, when necessary, to cause desired effects. Shaw's argues that instead of talking about definitions of mental illness, so things like, oh, he's bipolar, or she's experiencing severe depression, we should talk about problems of living and social stress, the individual's struggle with how to live in their world. He and others believe that positive mental health is promoted by our competence in dealing with our own environment and our confidence in being able, when necessary, to cause desired effects. I think what Shaw's is trying to get at is that, quite frankly, if you look at mental health in its fundamental perspective, you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who hasn't experienced something that resembles challenges with their mental health. Quite frankly, if you get nervous when you're walking into a classroom because you've got an exam that day, you're experiencing anxiety. You are experiencing a mental health condition. If there are times when it's hard for you to get out of bed, you just don't want to face the day, you might be suffering from a mild form of depression. And so I think it's important, and what Shaw's, I think, is trying to say is that rather than thinking that there's all of these little categories and we fit people in these boxes about you're bipolar, you're schizophrenic, you're experiencing depression, quite frankly, we probably should be looking at everybody and be making modifications and changes in our environment to be able to accommodate that. Today I'm not feeling very happy, or today I'm feeling very nervous about this particular thing that's coming up. And how does the environment and how does your family, your support system recognize that and then able to lend support to that? So the commonly supported theory is that mental health problems are the result of a variety of factors. Everything from heredity, biology, genetics. There's strong evidence that mental illness may be hereditary, passed from parent to child. Mental illnesses are also viewed increasingly as a chemical imbalance in the brain. That's going back to that medical model that we talked about. So just as there are chemical imbalances in terms of body function, resulting in things like diabetes, why can't we be thinking about the fact that often mental illness may be associated with chemical imbalances in the brain? And so the quote from the National Alliance on Mental Illness says, just as diabetes is a disorder of the pancreas, mental illnesses are brain disorders that often result in a diminished capacity for coping with the ordinary demands of life. So we are going to pause here. And when we come back, we will start to talk about why do people develop mental health problems.